Hi, everyone. We are going to allow a few minutes to give everybody time to log on, but welcome and thank you for joining today. We'll wait one more minute. All right. It is 12:02, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our Drinking Water and PFAS 101 panel. My name is Paige Samblonay, and I'll be moderating the panel today. This panel is a part of our Intro to Environmental Law series that has been running for a few years now. And it is being put on by the Environmental Law section and New Lawyers section of the California Lawyers Association. All right, so I'm going to do a few introductory slides real quick before we get into the main content for today. And I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible because we have a lot to cover today on such an important topic. So first off, the California Lawyers Association is a nonprofit, voluntary organization dedicated to the professional advancement of attorneys practicing in the state of California. Currently, I believe it has 18 sections of different subject matter areas. One of those sections being the environmental law section, whose mission is to advance the quality, breadth, and availability of information and services related to environmental, natural resources, land use, and energy law, and to enhance the profession by cultivating a well-informed, collegial, and diverse group of lawyers and law students throughout the state. Another one of those sections is the New Lawyers section, which represents lawyers in their first 8 years of practice, and its mission is to advance practical skills, leadership, and pro bono opportunities, networking, and to meet the needs of new lawyers. Today, we have two wonderful panelists, Nicole DiCamillo, who is an attorney at the State Water Resources Control Board. Nicole represents the Division of Drinking Water, advising on federal and state drinking water laws, regulations, and policies. Her tenure at the State Water Board also includes legal work on petroleum, underground storage tank cleanup, and contaminated site remediation. Next, we have George Croton, who is an attorney at the East Bay Municipal Utility District, which is a publicly owned utility providing water and wastewater services to the East San Francisco Bay Area. He handles matters relating to wastewater, environmental regulatory compliance, and energy. His practice covers a range of subject matter areas and statutory regimes, including the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, CERCLA, and RCRA. And so a quick look at our agenda for today. We'll first start off with a little discussion of the career paths that each panelist took to get to where they are today, followed by our drinking water and PFAS presentations by the panelists, which will include work examples, opportunities, and resources. And then we'll discuss some ways to get involved with CLA and then end with a Q&A session. Please feel free to hold your questions until the end of the panel or drop them in the chat and we will address them during the Q&A session. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to the panelists.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay?
Good.
Great. Thank you so much, Paige and Pam, for putting on this presentation. As Paige mentioned, we're going to talk in the beginning just briefly about our own career path, since my understanding is many of you here listening are maybe students or new attorneys. So I have been at the State Water Board for about 6 years, and I initially, way back, have had a long-standing interest in public health and environmental protection. I studied biology in undergraduate. And then I worked in ecotoxicology and genetic research fields, which I found rewarding, but didn't feel connected enough to policy and making change on the ground for environmental protection. So I ended up in law school and studied, focused on environmental and public interest law. I took a wide variety of clinics and did a full-time externship in a social justice section of the Santa Clara County Council. So for all the students out there, I definitely encourage you to do as much practical experience as you can. I think the externship and the environmental law clinic and community lawyering clinic, those were all wonderful hands-on experiences. And then I started off in private practice at a small firm where we represented plaintiff side environmental cases. We also represented some small municipal organizations. So that was a great experience to get a wide variety of exposure for environmental and land use laws. Then I worked at an environmental nonprofit and advocacy organization where we did state, federal, local land use and environmental protection work. Worked on some Endangered Species Act cases, a lot of CEQA, NEPA, so a pretty broad range of experience there. And then I started at the Water Board, had a really long-standing interest in public health as it relates to environmental health. And so it's been a great experience here. And I think that personally, I find that working in the government sector has been a great balance to me of, taking into account the needs of a lot of people and protection for, the people of the state of California. So as Paige mentioned, I started off in the underground storage tank cleanup unit. And so we're working on petroleum remediation and other toxic remediation. And then I've been in the drinking water division for about 3.5 years. So, and I'll talk in detail about that, but I'll include my email on the slides, and anyone can feel free to reach out to me to talk about environmental law careers. And yeah, it's very rewarding. So thanks.
And it's funny because a lot of what I'm going to say right now just sort of mirrors Nicole. Maybe that's true for a lot of folks who are interested in environmental law, but yeah, I went to law school and decided to become a lawyer specifically because I was interested in environmental issues and environmental law. That was my goal. And for me, that really came out of kind of just being an outdoorsy person and enjoying backpacking and hiking and exploring really beautiful natural places. And I developed, an interest in working to protect natural resources. And I had a lot of great mentors when I was younger who really instilled those values in me. That included high school teachers, college professors, family members, and some of my closest friends. So that was my intent, and my goal was to be an environmental lawyer. And when I went to law school at UC Law SF, formerly UC Hastings, that was my focus. I took environmental law classes and learned a lot. But my first job out of law school, I went to a large-ish, like full-service defense firm as a litigator. I really wanted the benefit of the experience you can get in that kind of environment, complex work, sophisticated cases, working in that kind of intense environment. And it was beneficial, even though I didn't want to do it in the long term. But I did a whole bunch of different things at first. I bopped around between different practice groups. I did securities litigation, employment litigation, none of which were particularly interesting or satisfying to me personally. That's not a knock on folks who might enjoy that kind of work. There are some people who thrive in it, but eventually attached myself to the maritime law practice group, which has a significant environmental component because the shipping industry, maritime world generally is heavily regulated from the environmental perspective. There's air quality requirements, ocean going discharges like oil and ballast water. I'm sure everyone has heard of or is familiar with like the Exxon Valdez disaster, for example, unfortunately. There was also offshore renewable energy projects that I got to work on, like offshore wind farms, which was all very interesting. Plus, I just liked going on ships. I got to travel and go to different ports and meet people from all over the world and hang out on giant shipping, ocean-going ships, which was cool. But that still wasn't scratching the itch for me in terms of environmental law. So I went to a small plaintiffs firm working for a mentor of mine. I had worked there as a law clerk during law school and then went back there as a lawyer. And I did really a 50-50 split of kind of general litigation and then plaintiff side environmental litigation. I was working on Endangered Species Act cases, like representing nonprofit groups in connection with logging projects. I did NEPA and CEQA cases, Clean Water Act, all kinds of stuff. Represented local commercial fishermen in pollution cases. That was a great job, very fast paced, and I got great experience and worked with some fantastic people. But I had really always kind of envisioned myself working in government in a way that really touched policy and involves natural resources management. And I got exactly that when I landed at East Bay Mud. I very much like my job here. So I work on a whole host of things, most of which are environmental in nature. I advise our wastewater department and our regulatory compliance office, as well as our energy group. But a significant component of my work relates to drinking water and water quality and the associated regulatory requirements. So, and like Nicole, I'm always happy to speak with anybody about career paths or job opportunities, anything like that. So please feel free to reach out anytime. Thank you.
Thank you both for that. Nicole, are you having trouble sharing your screen? Would you like any assistance?
Sorry about that. I'm trying to
No worries.
pull up the presentation here. And share some. Sorry about that. Trying to get that, what we had where it was the full screen. Sorry.
No worries. Yeah. It should be down in the lower right-hand corner. There's like a little presentation button. I should be sharing the other screen without the notes portion. Perfect. There you go.
Great. Thanks. Sorry for the delay there. Okay, thank you so much. So again, my name is Nicole DiCamillo, and I think this picture reminds me that one thing I forgot to mention in my career path was a really amazing, this is the Pacuare River in Costa Rica, and I did an international environmental law program right after graduating, and it was to the University of Florida and the University of Costa Rica joint program. And another thing I'd highly recommend if you get a chance is to do any sort of international work and to broaden your perspective and give you a experience with international law. So this was environmental and watershed management. So I'll just start with my standard lawyerly disclaimer that the views that I expressed today in this presentation are those of my own and don't necessarily reflect the views of the State Water Board or individual members of the board or the state of California. So the State Water Resources Control Board, our mission is to preserve, enhance, and restore the quality of California's water resources and drinking water for the protection of the environment, public health, and all beneficial uses, and to ensure proper water resource allocation and efficient use for the benefit of present and future generations. It's a very long sentence that basically means we protect the quantity and the quality of water and work towards providing sustainable water to the state of California. We have multiple divisions responsible for different areas of water law, water quality, regional water boards, water rights, and of course, Division of Drinking Water, which is what I'll be talking about today. So we regulate, unsurprisingly, drinking water. So we have multiple sections of the Division of Drinking Water. The point of this is just to give you an impression of how wide-ranging our work is and how many moving parts, engineers, data scientists, water quality scientists, a whole host of different fields. So the state is divided up into Northern and Southern California field operations branches, which is further divided up into sections and further divided up into district offices. So although as an attorney for the State Water Board, your client, our client is the State Water Board itself, day to day, I work with division staff all over the state. So today I'll be talking about the major responsibilities of the Division of Drinking Water. I'm going to touch on three main areas. Maintaining primary enforcement for the federal safe drinking water, which is called primacy under the US EPA. So I'll talk about that first. And then implementation of our own state California Safe Drinking Water Act and regulations. And last, and something that I think hopefully is very interesting to everyone, and one of the most enjoyable parts of my work is how we implement some state programs and policies designed to increase access to affordable and safe drinking water that are state specific. So these are beyond the kind of standard drinking water regulation framework, but designed to help water systems meet the requirements of drinking water laws. So just to give you an overview of the regulatory framework in which we're working. So you'll see here US EPA at the top. US EPA implements the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act and drinking water regulations. And then the State Water Board, below that, we implement that Federal Safe Drinking Water Act and our own California Safe Drinking Water Act and regulations and those California specific laws and policies. There are some roles for counties as well. So I won't go into too much detail on that, but counties tend to regulate smaller systems or private and domestic wells. So we don't actually have oversight or regulate private and small, very, very small systems. So that's just to give you kind of a big picture here. So what is primacy or primary enforcement authority? You may have heard of the concept of cooperative federalism. So this is, if you're familiar with the Clean Air Act and SIPs or state implementation plans, basically where the government allows states to implement and enforce federal law. So this is kind of analogous to those SIPs, if you are familiar with that. We'll talk a little bit more about primary drinking water standards and what that means, but US EPA adopts those primary drinking water standards and then authorizes states to apply for primacy. California's had it since, I believe, about 1978. Most states have it. This is really a brief excerpt of all the requirements to maintain primacy. There's a lot more listed in 40 CFR section 142.10. Just to kind of give you an overview. So a state has to set standards that are no less stringent than the national primary drinking water standards. And we have to have requirements for public water systems that are no less stringent than EPA's requirements. One particular requirement of primacy is to have a state program for certification of laboratories that conduct testing of drinking water. So we have that here at the State Board. That's part of our gambit of Division of Drinking Water is this ELAP, Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program. So our Drinking Water Act is intended to enable us to meet these primacy standards, of course, but then we also go above and beyond. So the California Safe Drinking Water Act is intended to improve upon the minimum requirements of the federal act. And personally, working for a state and state agency that is a leader in pushing for regulations that are more protective of public health than they have to be is, one of the reasons for me personally, I'm very happy working for the state of California. So these are this is just a brief slide just saying, what do the attorneys do? What's our role in this maintaining primacy? So we work pretty closely in the division with US EPA, the Region 9. So we assist our staff in that collaborative process with US EPA, responding to US EPA's inquiries, basically making sure that this collaborative federalism is working, that, we're doing what we need to do under the federal law. And so that's a big part of our role in that. So for each of these sections, I have some slides about what the attorneys do, just to kind of give you, some insight into what are the tasks we do day to day. Okay, so I'll move on to the second area now, which is implementing and enforcing our own California Safe Drinking Water Act. So the California Safe Drinking Water Act regulates public water systems, and despite the name public water system, because it serves the public, they can be publicly or privately owned for the provision of water for human consumption through pipes or other conveyances. So some people are surprised to find that a public water system is not just your large utility. You get a bill every month for your water, and it's, you see the water treatment plants, and it's maybe run by the city or another, or for example, East Bay Mud, where George works, and we'll be talking to you about. Those are, of course, public water systems, the very visible kind, but they're not the only public water systems in our state. A standalone gas station or a campground or even a school that's not connected to another municipal water system and has its own water supply can be a public water system. And human consumption too has a broader definition than just the cup of water you're drinking. Human consumption means for drinking, of course, but bathing, showering, preparing food, oral hygiene, hand washing. So this is important because, we don't limit the definition very narrowly so that we're reaching water that's going to make its way to people more than just drinking. So we don't have an official poll in this, an interactive poll in this presentation, but I just wanted to do a little quiz. You can just kind of, you don't necessarily have to answer it in the chat, but just for yourself, think of how many public water systems are there in California. So there's about 75 electric utilities in California. There are 900 wastewater treatment plants. And so if you were to guess how many public water systems there are in the state, curious what it's would think. Unless you're super familiar with this area, I'm guessing you may have underestimated. So there are actually 7,300, give or take, public water systems in California. So it's a significantly higher number of public water systems than other utilities. And as you'll see, this makes regulation challenging because a lot of these systems are small and they're underfunded and they struggle with management and financial and technical capacity to really run the water system properly. So that's what this slide is showing. This figure is basically conveying to you how many of those 7,300 systems are small. So these are community water systems. So this isn't the whole 7,300, but the gist of this slide is telling you that over 80% of our systems serve less than 3,000 connections, and almost 90% serve less than 10,000. So just to contrast that, Georgia's system, East Bay Mud, a system like that serves 1.4 million people. And the problem with that is a lot of these small water systems really struggle. So these pictures are real. These are from field inspections. This is not probably what you have in mind when you think about where your water comes from and a nice big clean water treatment facility. But this is where a lot of people in the state are getting their water from systems like this. This fragmented infrastructure, and that a lot of these systems that are so small just do not have the capacity to meet the demand for actual water itself and the drinking water standards. So this is where a lot of our efforts at the State Water Board are to finance solutions. And unfortunately, a lot of our efforts in compliance, in enforcement citations, penalties for the lack of compliance. So I'm gonna talk more about what we're doing about systems like this, and especially the last section. So this is another, just driving home the same point, about 88% of the state's failing water systems serve less than 500 connections. So very, very small. This map, the red dots show systems that are considered to be failing. Failing means they consistently fail to meet drinking water standards. With MCL violations, we can talk about MCLs in just a minute, or E. coli violations. Probably most people are familiar with E. coli. It's bacteriological contamination that can make folks really sick. So going a little bit back to what does it mean to be failing, and what does it mean to fail to meet drinking water standards or have a violation? We adopt these primary drinking water standards, which are maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs. And they have to be as close to the public health goals set by the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment as feasible. So this is the US EPA limitations. So you'll see on this chart, so this chart goes on and on and on. This is just a piece of it, but there's an MCL, the maximum contaminant level. What are the effects of it? What are the sources of this contaminant, and the public health goals? So a lot of times the public health goal is 0 or very, very tiny amounts. That's what we really like. But the MCL kind of takes into account, some of the limitations of the technology to get there, or the cost of that technology. So I know George is going to talk a little bit more in detail about this process of setting MCLs, but summary is basically we set them at the board to meet or exceed federal standards. We also adopt what's called secondary drinking water standards. So these are more aesthetic in nature. So these are like odor, turbidity, color. So they might not necessarily be acutely health related, but they do affect confidence in water. If your water smells bad or looks funny, even if it's technically safe, it's going to make people question whether it's safe. So I have 3 slides here of common drinking water contaminants. I'm not going to go through every one, but I just kind of wanted to highlight that, especially in California, given all the agriculture we have in our state, that nitrate and arsenic are pretty large areas of concern. Nitrate is particularly problematic for young children and babies, can even be fatal with too high of exposure. Uranium is an issue also related to fertilizer runoff, but also naturally occurring in some of the Sierra Mountain ranges. And I guess my point in bringing up all of these common drinking water contaminants is to kind of tie it back to the small system concerns and say that all of these contaminants can be treated and successfully and make the water safe, but it does require enough funding and proper management and expertise to actually run a water system and implement the treatment properly. And a lot of these small systems, just are really struggling to do that. So I have a few slides here that I'll go through kind of quickly. You can read more of them later, but I just want to kind of touch on what do we do to meet those drinking water standards? How do we help public water systems do that? So we issue permits. Public water system can't operate without a permit. So it's going to include the requirements to help them meet those standards. We can suspend or revoke a permit for continued failure to comply with those standards. We require monitoring and reporting. We require public notification of violations. There's also a requirement of all public water systems to put out an annual consumer confidence report. Here's George's, East Bay Muds. I'll give you a little spoiler that they're excellent and they have an excellent compliance record. But even working at the water board before I worked in drinking water, I didn't know that every water system has this. You can find it on their website, and they're required to issue this every year. So definitely check out your own water system. Hopefully it all looks good. So we do enforcement for violations. We can issue citations, penalties. This is an example here of a citation for failure to monitor for disinfection byproducts. So even the chemicals that clean the water can't be in too high of a concentration, or that can be harmful as well. So systems are required to monitor, and this particular system did not monitor for those products, so we issued a citation. Again, a few slides here about what do the attorneys do. I won't go through every single one on this list, but we assist with guidance on interpreting the laws and permitting process, enforcement, regulatory development to meet the guidelines, federal and state guidelines, legislation, litigation. We assist in litigation. Generally, drinking water you would think is not super contentious. You would think everyone wants clean drinking water. That's more or less the case. We don't see as much litigation, say, as the Air Board in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, much more controversial sometimes, but we have been sued. We were sued a couple years ago about our maximum contaminant level for hexavalent chromium by a chemical manufacturing association. So it happens. So we work on that too. Okay, so we touched on the first two, primacy and our own Safe Drinking Water Act. And now I really want to dive into some of these state programs that are designed to, really help systems to meet these goals or maybe meet these laws. So you might be familiar with other areas, where California kind of has gone above and beyond federal regulatory requirements, like in greenhouse gas emissions and things like that. So similarly in drinking water, we're trying to make laws that really push the envelope and help provide more safe drinking water for our state. So I'm going to talk about three areas. As I mentioned, we have so many small failing systems. We're trying to work on creative solutions to improve access. So the first one I'm going to talk about, I'll talk about the Human Right to Water Law, SB 200, which is called SAFER, and SB 1263, which is requirements for discouraging establishment of new unsustainable public water systems. So the Human Right to Water Law was signed in 2012, and it's in our water code, recognizing that every human being has the right to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible water. And I think what's important to me about this is that, not only is it just, I think, a great recitation of a human right, and it might sound like, well, yeah, isn't that obvious that everyone deserves that? But it provides the framework and legal authority to implement other laws and policies and funding to meet this right. So I think since this was signed in 2012, I think it's really kind of accelerated our ability to actually meet that goal, because as we talked about, not everyone is actually getting safe drinking water. So one of those major programs we have for that is called SAFER, which stands for Safe and Affordable Funding for Equity and Resilience, which is long, but this was went into effect in 2019. The SAFER program establishes a set of tools, funding sources, regulatory authorities to help struggling water systems. It's driven by collective responsibility, so trying to engage all the parties, the water systems, nonprofit, local government, in the solutions. So what are some of those tools? I'm going to talk in detail a little bit about consolidations and administrators, but there's also technical assistance and a host of different tools and funds. This program involves collaboration with the Division of Financial Assistance and Office of Public Participation at the State Water Board, because it's kind of baked into this program to really have a public process for these programs. The Division of Financial Assistance, I'll just briefly mention, is really essential and integral to implementing these solutions. They provide grants, loans, and emergency funds. Sometimes there's times when folks just need to get some bottled water really fast and things like that. So DFA is integral to that. So SAFER starts off with an integral component of SAFER is the data analysis and study. So we need to really know where are the greatest areas of needs, and where should our priority go for available state funding and intervention measures like the consolidations. This drinking water needs assessment is a really impressive large-scale study on all of this. So what have we learned from SAFER? So there's a lot of data on this slide. I apologize. It's a little much on one slide, but the gist of it is that failing and at-risk systems are overwhelmingly small and overwhelmingly in economically disadvantaged communities. So more than 2/3 of the failing water systems are located in low-income, socioeconomically disadvantaged communities, primarily in the Central Valley. So this is forcing residents who can least afford it to purchase expensive bottled water. So it's really a very big social justice issue in California, and one that we're trying to work on here. So just to give you a sense of the scale of that, I have one more little quiz of if you can take a guess how many Californians don't consistently have access to clean water that meets drinking water standards. And unfortunately, it's a really large number. It's over 1 million. And if you take into account schools that are public water systems, it jumps up even a little bit more. So that's a lot of people in a state that you think of as, you know, very wealthy and in some ways and prosperous and progressive. And so this slide is basically just showing you the numbers from the study that I just presented, about 1.2 million people in these failing systems. And again, I realize I'm repeating myself, but the vast majority of these failing systems are small, so less than 3,000 connections. So again, a real human rights and public health issue. This table, again, a lot of details, but the gist of it is also that the failing and at-risk systems, insult to injury, often have high costs for water as well. And so this makes sense when you consider that small water systems don't have the economies of scale to make the water really affordable. So what are we doing about it? That was depressing. How are we trying to help? How are we trying to make this better? So one of these tools is consolidation. Consolidation, as it sounds, is the joining of two or more water systems, usually a smaller failing one being absorbed into a larger and more well-functioning system. It can be mandatory or voluntary. It can be physical or managerial, which basically means physical is literally connecting the systems with pipes, and managerial means the more sophisticated, more well-funded system, larger one will take over the operation and management of the smaller one. We at the state board can mandate this when we have a disadvantaged community and the system is consistently failing to supply adequate water. And when we find that it's technically and economically feasible and effective and cost effective. So, you know, we have to study it, we have to make sure, but we can mandate it when we think it's appropriate. This is an example of a consolidation letter, a letter saying we're going to start this mandatory process. Since SAFER, we have completed, prior to SAFER, there were already consolidations, but SAFER has definitely started to accelerate this process with increased funding and capacity. We've had 94 completed consolidations, which translates to, on the ground, to 56,000 more people now having safe drinking water. Here's two examples, case studies. On the left is a high school in Tulare County that serves 1,200 students and staff. They had a continuing nitrate problem. They're now connected to a larger water district and have access to non-contaminated water. And on the right was a mobile home park in Kern County that serves about 200 people. And they were constantly having outages due to inadequate source capacity and treatment, and now they're connected and have reliable water. So these are just two examples, and there's a lot more. We're just kind of getting started with the second tool, which is administrator authority and funding. So a water system administrator is basically a specialist in drinking water that provides technical, managerial, or financial expertise to a small struggling system. So this letter is an example of saying, hey, we're going to be putting an administrator in place to address this failing system. They basically step in and help run the system. So they don't own it, but they kind of take over running it, and it's funded through SAFER. So some of these administrators could be counties or for-profit water systems or engineering services. This is more new than consolidations. So we have designated 18 systems so far as in need of an administrator, and we hope to have probably by the end of this year about 5 administrators in place, and it's just going to keep growing from there. These are some of our successes since SAFER. Again, SAFER has really kind of pushed things along. And then this, if you get the PowerPoint, there's a link in here to a really great story about the Coachella Valley Water District, which is a big district working to consolidate small dilapidated water systems with lots of issues, Chrome 6, arsenic contamination into their larger system, and really improve the quality of life for the residents in that area. So I encourage you to watch that video if you get a chance. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is SB 1263. Oh, I will go back and just briefly say that there's a lot more than I can talk about today in terms of tools. As you might imagine, you know, some of the systems just can't consolidate, they're too rural, or, you know, there might be just other infrastructure that needs to happen. So we're helping to fund, you know, treatment on site or regional oversight, like getting the counties involved to come up with some regional solutions. So it's broader than just administrators and consolidations, but those are kind of the big tools with SAFER. So the last thing I'll talk about is SB 1263. This I think of as kind of a lessons learned law. So I think you've already gotten the point, hopefully, that small systems face a lot of challenges, and knowing that some of the biggest problems with adequacy come from small systems, what can we do to avoid these problems moving forward? So we're working to fix the issues with the existing systems, but how can we stop from recreating the problems of small systems? So the legislature said it's the policy of the state to discourage the establishment of new unsustainable public water systems when there is a feasible alternative. So now if you know, a company or a person or whoever wants to start a public water system, they have to submit this, it's called a preliminary technical report. It's a pretty detailed study of the feasibility of connecting with an existing system nearby, especially doing a cost comparison with consolidation and studying the long-term costs of operation and maintenance of the small system. And this has to be submitted before any construction can occur. And, you know, the idea is basically, let's really study this. And is this really sustainable and feasible? And if not, let's connect so that we're avoiding those problems we've seen in small systems. So what do we do as the attorneys? We advise the division on these requirements from these laws, and then we work on the funding. We assist in reviewing and drafting the policies that implement these laws. So since these are all really new, it's very exciting work. You know, there's not a history of a well-established history of, you know, what do these things mean and how do we do this consolidation? So we're learning every day, and it's really exciting work, and really enjoy it, and especially seeing on the ground improvement for people with access to clean water. So I know that was a lot, but I really appreciate your time and listening. If you're interested in legal careers with the State Water Board, this is the website for state jobs. We have attorneys 1 through 4 or 5. And if you're a student, graduate legal assistant positions are great because you don't have to have passed the bar yet. You graduate, you take the bar, and then you can work while you're waiting for the bar results to come. So it's a great chance to get started. We also have externships. My understanding is we're full for the fall, but we will be accepting for spring and summer. Lauren Marshall, attorney in our office, is the contact person for that. And I am more than happy to have you email me and ask me any questions, and I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much, Nicole. George, will pass the sharing of the screen off to you now.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Nicole. And yeah, give me 1 second to kind of configure my monitors. Okay. Does that work?
Perfect.
Great. Okay. Okay, well, as Paige introduced me, my name is George, and I work at the East Bay Municipal Utility District. So what is East Bay Mud? And I remember distinctly being in law school and hearing the name East Bay Mud being thrown around, like in the academic context, or just talking to folks who lived in the East Bay, and thinking in my simple mind that it was a weird name because, like, if they do drinking water, why is their name Mud? But what MUD stands for is Municipal Utility District, which is a form of local public agency. We span, across Alameda and Contra Costa counties, include most of the cities in the East Bay that you're familiar with, and we provide drinking water to approximately 1.4 million people, and wastewater service for 740,000 people. We were founded in 1923, so this is our centennial year. We've been operating for a century, which is a very big deal for all of us at the district, and everyone is very excited and proud to have been doing what we do for 100 years. And really, when East Bay Mud was formed back in 1923, the goal was to replace a patchwork of local, small, privately held water companies that were on the verge of failure. The population of the East Bay was really booming at that time. The area was rapidly growing, and there wasn't an adequate supply of water to support that growth. So East Bay Mud was a huge infrastructure investment with the goal of saving the East Bay from what at that time was called water famine. I don't know if that terminology is still used today, but I kind of like the wording there. So I was thinking about this, and I don't think you can really talk about water quality without referencing water supply, because where your water comes from can dictate what it contains in terms of contaminants or otherwise. And East Bay Mud is lucky because we have a really great water supply, and maybe luck isn't the right word because a huge amount of work went into and continues into providing that high quality water. But the vast majority of our water supply is Sierra snowmelt from the Sierra Nevada mountain range, specifically the Mokelumne River watershed. So it's very high quality from the outset. The watershed is largely undeveloped, it's pristine mountain wilderness. There's no major population centers or industries nearby. So it's just cold, clean snowmelt. It's low in alkalinity and hardness, and makes for a really great starting point for drinking water. We also get a small percentage of our water supply from our local watersheds here in the East Bay, which drain into our local reservoirs, some of which may be familiar to you if you live in the area, like Upper San Leandro and Lafayette. And we also have a contract with the federal government for Sacramento River water that's available to us during drought years. But the Mokelumne River is the main deal. It's what we talk about when we talk about our water supply. So hopefully this image is fairly clear. You can see the whole operation, which is pretty massive. On the far right of the map up here, the blue blob is the Mokelumne River watershed, the headwaters of which are way up by near Caples Lake, which is close to Kirkwood Ski Resort, if any of you ski or snowboard. And that all flows down from the watershed into the river down to Pardee Reservoir, which is our main drinking water supply reservoir. Pardee has a capacity of approximately 198,000 acre feet, which is equivalent to a 10-month supply for our 1.4 million water customers. Water then flows out of Pardee and down to Comanche Reservoir, which is really like our secondary reservoir that provides for flood control, as well as storing water for fisheries in the Mokelumne River, like salmon and steelhead. There's water available for riparian habitat, as well as for downstream water rights holders. So other folks on the Mokelumne who, have a claim on the Mokelumne's water. And here on the map, you can see where we operate the Mokelumne River Fish Hatchery in conjunction with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, which really the goal is to supplement and support salmon and steelhead populations in the lower Mokelumne River. Finally, water then flows down the Mokelumne aqueducts all the way across the valley to the East Bay, to our local reservoirs and our water treatment plants, before it goes to folks' taps in our service area, which we will get into in a second. So here's Pardee Dam, and I think this is a recent photo, because you can see how high the water level is. You can see the spillway operating over there, given our recent extremely heavy winter. Construction of Pardee Dam began in July 1927. It was completed in 1929 with the first release of water into the Mokelumne Aqueduct occurring on June 23rd, 1929. And it was just in time because the East Bay was not in a great place prior to that in terms of water supply. Pardee Dam was the highest dam in the world at the time that it was completed. I've been out to visit. It's very cool. It's just an incredibly impressive feat of engineering and operation. If you work at East Bay Mud, you can actually climb all the way up in the interior, up about 1,000 steps to what's called the complaint department at the very top. I've done it once and I'm never going to do it again because it was very difficult, but interesting. So everything I've shown you so far and that I've discussed really relates to supply. And like I said earlier, supply and quality overlap in some ways because the source can often impact the quality. And now what I'm going to get into kind of overlaps with some of what Nicole discussed, but really, water rights, raw gallonage, the timing and volume of releasing flows downstream is not the focus of this webinar. We're here to talk about what makes water safe for human consumption and the associated legal requirements that set those parameters. So as a public water system, we are subject to oversight and regulation at both the federal and state levels, the EPA federally, and the state board, Nicole's office, at the state level. And the basic benchmark, which Nicole discussed, is that the state regulation can't be less stringent than federal legislation. And frequently in California, state regulation is more stringent and goes above and beyond the federal requirements. So a little bit of history. For much of early US history, the legal framework was primarily concerned with supply, who gets how much water, who owns the rights, etc. And that's particularly true in the West, where water was much less abundant than in the riparian East. And the East Bay is really a prime example here because it was growing so rapidly at the beginning of the 20th century, and maintaining an adequate water supply was a struggle. But even though the focus was really on supply, early on, public health officials were realizing that water quality was important, particularly in urban areas where there were significant issues with waterborne diseases like typhoid and cholera. So in 1912, you saw the first federal effort to start regulating water quality, primarily to combat those waterborne diseases. And this introduced chlorination, specifically in connection with typhoid. The first permanent disinfection system for drinking water in the US was made in 1908 to the Jersey City water supply. But it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s, during the height of the environmental movement, where you saw a concerted effort at the federal level to try and ensure public had access to clean, safe drinking water. And this was really, the golden age of environmental legislation, where you get all the big hits like the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, NEPA, and the Safe Drinking Water Act. So people had figured out that industrial byproducts and hazardous materials were contaminating their drinking water, and they got rightfully upset about it. Studies from that time indicated that the majority of drinking water supplies had some unacceptable level of contaminants. So that all culminated with the Safe Drinking Water Act at the federal level in 1974, followed shortly thereafter by the California Safe Drinking Water Act in 1976. And as Nicole discussed, what this legislation did in its simplest terms was empower the regulators to set limits on contaminants in drinking water, enforceable, actionable limits, and impose various associated monitoring and reporting requirements to really keep the public apprised of what was in their water, how it was being treated, how problems were being solved. And not to repeat Nicole too much, but California has assumed primacy under the Public Water Supply Supervision Program. So it's responsible for implementation and enforcement of the federal act. The EPA monitors compliance chiefly by reviewing reports submitted by the states, and that goes to that cooperative federalism that was discussed. So EPA currently has 90 listed contaminants. California may have more. I'm not sure, actually. I might punt that to Nicole, but each of those contaminants has an associated maximum contaminant level. And some of these contaminants include organics, metals, man-made and natural substances. Some of the big ones include arsenic, lead, giardia, fecal coliform, all of the stuff that you don't want in your water. And all of these listed contaminants have both an MCL and an MCLG. The MCL is the maximum amount of a contaminant that is allowed. It's a regulatory requirement. It's subject to enforcement. And MCLG is a maximum contaminant level goal. And it is what it says. It's a goal, and it represents the maximum level of a contaminant in drinking water at which no known or anticipated adverse effect on the health of persons would occur, allowing for an adequate margin of safety. So how does EPA determine an MCL or set an MCL? And it's really a cost benefit analysis is what it boils down to. So MCLs look to both public health needs and the economic feasibility of treating for the contaminant. The estimated cost is also used to assess the financial impact of reducing the contaminant on the end consumers. So really like how the cost of treating for these contaminants will eventually trickle down, no pun intended, to the ratepayers, the folks who actually get the water out of their taps. And the Safe Drinking Water Act gives the EPA some latitude if the costs of reaching the lowest possible level are not justified by the benefit, or if it creates the risk of other contaminants, like contaminants that are introduced through the process of treating for the specific contaminant in question, or otherwise interfere with meeting other Safe Drinking Water Act requirements. So there's a balancing of how much it'll cost to the system and ultimately, the system's customers to treat for the contaminant against the health risks posed by the contaminant. MCLGs, by contrast, consider only public health and not the cost or the limits of detection and treatment technology effectiveness. So they are sometimes set at levels at which water systems can't meet because of technological limitations. So how does East Bay mud measure up? And I was very kind of Nicole to to say nice things about us, but yeah, I am proud to say that we're very good at fulfilling our obligations under the Safe Drinking Water Act, and that is one of the advantages of being, a large, well-capitalized, sophisticated system that services so many people in such a dense urban area. In contrast to some of the smaller, rural, struggling systems that Nicole discussed. And East Bay Mud has a very comprehensive process for monitoring and treating our water. The first bullet here on the slide does not really do it justice. Without getting too far into the weeds, I'm going to give you the whole alphabet soup because there's some great words in here, but the whole process consists of aeration, coagulation, flocculation, which is a great word, sedimentation, filtration, disinfection, ozonation, fluoridation, and corrosion control. And throughout all that whole process, that treatment process, we are constantly testing our water to make sure that it's clear of contaminants and that we meet or surpass all state and federal requirements. Okay, so with all of that in mind, let's talk about PFAS. And you might already be aware of PFAS, what they are, what they represent in terms of contamination of drinking water or otherwise, because they've been all over the news. It's been rocking the water and regulatory world for quite a while, and they even made a movie about it, Dark Waters, starring Mr. Mark Ruffalo. But for those who aren't familiar, I will go over the background. PFAS are a group of synthetic organofluorine chemical compounds, which means they're human-made. And there are thousands of different types within the family, the broader PFAS family, but the ones you hear a lot about are PFOA and PFOS. So these were used throughout the 20th century in a whole host of consumer and industrial products due to their enhanced water-resistant properties. And they were used in all kinds of things, polishes, paints, coating, Teflon, Scotchgard, pots and pans, you name it. And AFFF, which is aqueous film forming foam, which is used or was used in firefighting, particularly at like large military installations and airports. So their ubiquity means that they are pretty much everywhere, literally everywhere. Unfortunately, basically everyone on this webinar right now has some amount detectable in their blood. They are, ubiquitous and very hard to destroy, which is why they're known as forever chemicals. And at certain levels, they can have significant health impacts on people and animals, including cancer, thyroid disease, and ulcerative colitis. So once how bad these things came to light, which took a while for various reasons, the regulators started making moves. And for the EPA, a significant component of that was to introduce a new drinking water regulation under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So the proposed rule was published earlier this year. It's not yet final, and it sets the MCL at a conservative level. And the MCLG is set at 0 because my understanding is that if a contaminant is potentially carcinogenic, it automatically means that the goal is to have none of it in your water, which is understandable. So for PFOA and PFOS, some of the ones that get talked about a lot, the proposed MCL is 4 parts per trillion or nanograms per liter. EPA is expecting or has said that they're going to finalize the rule by the end of this year. I'm not sure whether that deadline will stick. The regulatory wheels tend to move kind of slowly, and a lot could happen that might stall that process. There could hypothetically be a challenge, litigation, but the goal is to have a final rule by the end of 2023. So we will see what happens. In California, and Nicole might be able to add more color on this, but suffice it to say that California is likewise moving to regulate PFAS contamination, as well as legislatively do away with the products that contain PFAS that result in the contamination. It may be that things need to be settled at the federal level before more state action is taken, but a lot of states have introduced their own requirements. California right now, at present, has what are called notification levels and response levels for PFAS. Notification levels are informational, oriented towards keeping the public aware, but they're non-regulatory, non-enforceable. But response levels, by contrast, are actionable in that if a water source has levels in excess of the response level, then the state board can require that the water source be taken out of commission or treated. But it goes without saying that East Bay Mud and every water system in the country, you know, takes this very seriously, and that it presents a concern for our, you know, the folks who drink our water. And we're moving to, you know, respond to regulatory requirements as they develop. So how is East Bay Mud's water impacted? The good news is that East Bay Mud's water supply, when compared against some other systems, is in comparatively good shape. And this goes back to what I said in the beginning about the water source being a major dictator of water quality. So our water originates in a pristine mountain watershed. There's no Scotchgard factory upstream discharging into the river, no major airport up there where they're spraying AFFF. So we're in a better position than some other systems that might rely on heavily contaminated groundwater or sourced from a waterway with a major industrial operation upstream. All that said, we have still had some detections, some of which were in excess of the EPA's proposed MCL. We're still figuring out exactly where these detections are coming from, but this goes back to what I said earlier. These things are everywhere and in practically everything. The detects have been in our local reservoirs, which are obviously in a more developed environment than the Mokelumne River watershed. So how are we dealing with it? The first question in my mind, and that a lot of folks, is why should the public have to bear the expense of solving this problem? We're a public agency, not for profit. We're funded by our ratepayers, and the expense of installing new treatment technologies, you know, like I was saying, really is borne by the public. But you know, as alleged in some of the litigation we're going to discuss, there's a few large multinational corporations that are responsible for creating and propagating these chemicals around the world. Water systems like us are passive receivers in that we didn't create the chemicals or introduce them to our system. They just ended up there, and then we have to deal with them. So we, along with a lot of other public water systems, sued the collection of companies that are allegedly responsible for putting PFAS out into the world. So we're a party to a multi-district litigation that's in South Carolina, which is in some ways akin to a class action, in that it consolidates a large number of similar cases in order to try and resolve common issues of fact and law and handle everything on a single track. There have been two major class-wide settlements that were announced recently. You might have seen in the news. Those are still taking shape and are not final yet, so we will see what happens there. Regardless of how we get there and who bears the burden of solving the problem, one way or another, public water systems are going to have to comply with the regulatory requirements as they take shape. And depending on how things go, that could require implementing new treatment systems. So PFAS is notoriously difficult to destroy, and the technologies for doing so are still developing and uncertain. Right now, the best thing that everyone is looking to is carbon adsorption using granular activated carbon. But again, you know, it's a new frontier in terms of treatment. One thing that public water systems are concerned about is EPA's evaluation of the cost benefit analysis that we discussed earlier. Treating to meet the 4 parts per trillion standard will be, you know, expensive, and there's some debate over what level is the ideal level. Obviously, the ideal level is 0. That's why the goal is 0. But EPA estimates that it will cost somewhere between 700 million and $1.2 billion annually to treat for PFAS nationwide. But there was another study released recently that estimates that national annualized costs will be in excess of $3.8 billion. So obviously everyone is concerned and working to process the situation and respond accordingly. But the bottom line is that PFAS represent a public health concern, and the purpose of the Safe Drinking Water Act is to mitigate that concern. And our mission, part of our mission at East Bay Mud, is to provide clean, safe water for everyone who needs it. And so the process is underway. Water systems are moving, regulators are moving, government is moving at all levels to try and resolve this problem. So with that, this is our Centennial logo flowing into the future, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you all. And again, please feel free to contact me if you ever want to talk about a career in environmental law.
That was great. Thank you so much, Nicole and George. Really appreciate fitting all of that into an hour. So thank you for that. And George, if you don't mind just keeping your screen on and just proceeding to the next slide, if that's okay with you. Great, thank you. So quickly before we enter the Q&A, I just wanted to mention a few ways to get involved with CLA and the environmental law section and the new lawyer sections. First, you can join CLA, ELS, or NLS. And also all of these links are active within the PDF, and the PDF should now be in the chat for everybody to be able to download. If you have issues with that, please let us know and we'll send it to you directly. But feel free to join those sections. Also, it's free to law students to join. So that's a great way to get involved even before you graduate. And also attending events like these, the 101 series, is always a great way to be involved, ask questions, and get to know the people in the practice. Another great way is in-person events. The Yosemite Environmental Law Conference is coming up. It is October 19th through the 22nd, and it is an incredible conference where you are able to learn and network and meet people in the practice. I don't want to take up too much more time discussing this. They're all here. The mentorship videos. We have student negotiations competition, which is also incredible. Also, our mentorship program is really, really incredible. So I suggest you all check those out and feel free to ask us, if you have any questions or need some guidance or just have general questions about the practice. So the next slide is our last slide. It's our Q&A. So I'm sure I actually see a million questions, which is exactly what we wanted. So I'm going to start going through the list and I will ask them to both Nicole and George. So we can either keep this screen up or you can end it and we can see each other. It's up to you guys. But the first question that we have is, how does the public learn about revoked permits or failing water systems? And is there a website?
You can take that one. Let me put in the chat, actually, if that's helpful. There is. So we have Drinking Water Watch. So this is our safe drinking water database. And if you go to this website, you can enter in a system, and I'm looking at it right now. It might not be worth the time to share the screen. I'm not sure, but maybe I will if that's okay. Just because I think I'm kind of passionate about public access to. Well, see, this is the problem I have. Sometimes it's like it doesn't show up. Oh, here it is. Okay, share this. So this is the Drinking Water Watch website. I put in the system that I had actually posted a citation of in my presentation, Howell Mountain. Yeah. So this was a, so, yeah, so if you put in the name of the system and then you find it in here, and then over here on the left, you can see their, the water system details, you know, there's a lot in here. But over here, there's, violations and enforcement actions. So you can see this is definitely a problem, system with lots and lots of violations. So, yeah, that would be how you can access that information.
Great, thank you for that. And so our next question slash comment, it says, I know how depressing it is to know children are going without clean water. I know that in the Fresno area, the town of Tulare is not annexed and agriculture has polluted their water. Also, wells are dry. So feel free to comment on that if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is very, very upsetting. And I think, you know, especially like I mentioned, you know, a lot of people, I think if you're not familiar with the problem, you just think of all of the wealth that we have in this state, and to think that, you know, kids and, especially low communities not having access to both clean water and just water in general. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a big motivator for why I like doing what I do. So I just encourage anyone who wants to get involved, try to make it. I agree, it's very concerning.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, while we're on the topic of that, Nicole, can you go into more of the process of how public gets involved? I know you talked about how a lot of the state tools have this public part incorporated into them organically. And can you go a little bit deeper into that and kind of explain what that process is like, if you can?
Yeah, so I mean, all of these processes for like consolidation or administrator, they, you know, we reach out to the customers or the consumers that are served by these water systems, and they're just encouraged. There's like stakeholder meetings. They're encouraged to just come and talk about, you know, here's my experience with this water, and you know, here's what we're going through, and here's our concerns about, you know, if we are to be consolidated with a bigger system, or so the process of consolidation and appointing an administrator, you know, we do public meetings, so the public can come to those. We have, as a board, as a state, we have board meetings once a month, so the public can participate in those. I mean, that's much broader than just drinking water. There's water rights and water quality generally. You know, so, but I encourage anyone to look on our website and see what the, there's also, the public can sign up for to be on the listserv, so to find out when meetings on the SAFER program are happening, and to find out, you know, be part of the needs assessment that I mentioned, that study, you know, to just find out when the new studies are coming out and what we're looking at. And I think we try to be very transparent, you know, in the processes. So there's a lot, our website is full of information. So I definitely encourage you to check that out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you. So the next question is, with consolidations, how does the State Water Resources Control Board interact with LAFCOs and the process?
That's a great question. So for those who aren't familiar, LAFCO stands for the local, oh boy, let's see if I can get it right. The Local Agency Formation Commission. So it's
Nailed it.
so it's a state agency that basically is involved with when there are like annexations, like between cities or different districts. So the community services district, or it's kind of, I think it's fairly unique to California. Maybe other states have something similar, but so LAFCO is involved. So let me paste, or maybe I'll share my screen again. This might be helpful. I didn't see that question earlier, so I tried to pull that up. Okay, so this is Health and Safety Code 116682. And in the interest of time, I won't go into too much detail, but we are required at the State Water Board to consult and consider input from the LAFCO, the Local Agency Formation Commission, regarding this change. And then there's provision for like paying any fees that are associated with LAFCO. So basically, we are supposed to kind of liaison with LAFCO. We don't necessarily have to have LAFCO approval for the consolidations, but obviously, I think we want to, make everything go as smoothly as possible and not overlook, a LAFCO issue. So, yeah, we are meant to basically get their input, talk to them, make sure they're kind of on board, see if they have any concerns.
Great, thank you. George, I think this one might be geared towards you, and Nicole, feel free to chime in as well. This question says, it seems that this PFAS problem is better solved at a larger scale rather than attempting at a household scale. What steps are being taken to ensure that removed PFAS is not reintroduced into the water supply, thereby causing the same PFAS being removed over and over again?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because this goes to the forever chemicals piece, in that the granular activated carbon filtration that I discussed briefly, like that removes the compounds from the water, but then those compounds are still in that granular activated carbon. So what do you do with it? And that implicates a kind of whole other statutory regime to do with waste disposal that is not what we're talking about here today. But I think the real question in terms of like the technology is, how can we figure out a way to actually destroy these compounds? And as far as I know, I don't think we're there yet. I don't think that there is a mechanism for doing so. There are new technologies coming up. That I don't know anything about this company, but I saw an article about it where they have something called the PFAS Annihilator, which I thought was interesting. Haven't read up on it, but yeah, that will be, the hot topic in the future is, how do we actually destroy the forever chemicals rather than just moving them from one place to another?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Nicole, do you have any comments on that?
No, I mean, I agree with George. I mean, and having worked, in remediation previously, I mean, that's always the trick, right? Is like, you pull this stuff out and then what do you do with it? And, where are we creating hotspots of, like environmental justice issues with, where are the things stored then? And so, yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add other than.
Yeah, no, thank you. One that would be interesting to see if either of you know the answer to this. What would it take for chemical businesses to have to prove their chemicals are safe before adoption? I don't know who wants to tackle that, or if we can direct it to someone else who would know.
I'll try and jump in. I'm not super familiar with this process, but I think that there are regulatory mechanisms in place for like new chemicals being vetted by the government, right? Whether and to what extent those always work and always keep dangerous things out of the world is another question. I guess this goes back to business practices, like if companies have obligations to prove up to the regulators, like that what they're doing is safe, they need to fulfill those. But if they don't fulfill them, then unfortunately we're left with a situation where people have to deal with it after the fact.
Right. Thank you. This next question has a few questions, I think, in it. So I'll read the first one. I think both of you can also see the questions. So feel free to take it one question at a time. But it says, how is the California Water Board balancing our right to clean water with the USGS study that a great deal of our drinking water is contaminated with the 10,000 types of contaminants like PFAS. How effective is using a distiller with a VOC filter for these chemicals, heavy metals, and arsenic? Is the majority of Western LA County water from Northern California sources?
Sure, I'll jump in there. So for the first question, I mean, I think George talked a little bit about where we are at the federal level, and then in terms of PFAS, regulation development or contaminant level development at this state. We are also, so in 2022, we issued a general order to areas where or to water systems where we suspect there could be contamination to monitor. So we don't yet at the State Water Board have a maximum contaminant level, but we are trying to identify areas through monitoring requirements. So we are basically trying to get a handle on where these contaminants are and how bad is it. And so I would say we're somewhat early stages and also kind of balancing it with seeing what the federal EPA does. Yeah, somehow I don't know if it's still there. The second was about, I think, treatment and distillation treatment. And I'll be honest, I don't feel quite qualified to answer that question in terms of I think PFAS are, as George was discussing, very challenging. So I wouldn't say I would know the answer to that if that's an effective treatment for PFAS. And then the last question about where LA's water, Western LA water comes from. Yes, most of Western LA water comes from Northern California through the State Water Project. I don't know if there was anything more on that. If you look up in addition to like the consumer confidence report listing the testing results and the monitoring, it also lists sources. So you can also see in your consumer confidence report, if you look up your water agency, like where their water comes from. So you can find I've looked at LA's before, and LA, yeah, it lists out the different areas and there's maps and that. So you can find kind of the specific sources of your water.
Great, thank you. Next question is, have you all seen issues with water privatization? And do you anticipate any Supreme Court cases that might weaken protections and lead to increased water privatization? And feel free, whoever wants to take that first, feel free.
I don't know, George, if you have anything. I don't really, I'm not sure. I think water rights is a whole other realm of the State Water Board that I really couldn't speak to very eloquently. Yeah, I don't feel like I really.
I'm in kind of the same boat. Yeah, and I also, I work with one very large system. I would be surprised to see privatization in our context, because that's why we were founded, was to get away from some of the flaws of former small private systems here. And I think, Nicole, most privately owned systems in California are fairly small, right? Like yeah, okay.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't sure if the question was meaning sort of like what, like water rights, as water resources kind of dwindle, if.
Oh, yeah.
Or it was more about privately owned public water systems. I mean, we do have definitely a mixture of those based on like who owns the water. And California has its own water rights regime about, who actually owns the water. So I wasn't completely sure on the question, but I mean, we do have private water systems, privately owned water systems. And yeah, like George said, they are mostly.
Yeah, thank you. So one last question very quickly that I had for both of you is, so we're in this era where we see record droughts and have record temperatures and know that these trends will likely continue into the future due to climate change and will likely affect drinking water and water quality. Are either of you affected by these conditions? And if so, how so? And how are you addressing these issues? And that's our last question.
And maybe I'll jump into that. I mean, yeah, extreme weather events really impact our operations, and we have a huge, very long-term plan for dealing with climate change and addressing the impacts to our infrastructure, our water supply, our wastewater treatment system, the whole package. But yeah, like you saw with, we had several years of excessive drought, which were very difficult and required us to implement, restrictions on water consumption. And then we had like a near record-breaking winter, which is good from the perspective of like, okay, there's more water, but has a huge impact on our actual infrastructure. It's hard on our reservoirs, on our pipes, and we expect to see more of that going into the future. So it is a big part of our work collectively and my work individually.
I'll just add really quickly that, yeah, definitely, I mean, climate change has been the, not just drought, but the other impacts of climate change like fires. I mean, we've had a lot of issues with, small systems literally being destroyed, and people not having water for that reason, or contaminated based on, fire impacts from fire, the melting plastics and all the stuff that can get into the water supply. So we definitely deal with the fires, droughts, is going to push in some ways some small systems to use other sources that maybe aren't as clean and that need to spend more money to clean the water because it's a source that's generally offline, but they're tapping into it because there's not enough water in the primary source. So yeah, it's definitely the quantity of water, the quality, and affected by all of the climate change aspects.
Great, thank you. Wonderful answers. So thank you both so much, George and Nicole, for such a wonderful panel. And we apologize to the questions we couldn't get to. Feel free to email any of us, all of us. And our contact information is on the last page of the PDF. And thank you so much for tuning in, and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.